The clock struck 9:45 p.m. on a cold October evening in Washington, D.C. Rain pelted against the windshield of Officer James Morrison's patrol car as he monitored traffic on Constitution Avenue. His coffee had gone cold, and his mood matched the gloomy weather. After 15 years on the force, nights like these had become routine, but something about this evening felt different. Morrison noticed a black Cadillac Escalade SUV speeding through the wet streets. His radar gun flashed. 48 miles per hour in a 35 zone. He switched on his patrol car's lights and sirens, pulling out to follow the vehicle. The SUV continued for another block before finally turning on its signal and pulling over to the curb. In the Escalade, U.S. Attorney General Robert Hayes sat in the back seat, exhausted from a long day. He had dismissed his usual security detail for the evening, wanting privacy for his visit to Georgetown University Hospital, where his 78-year-old mother was fighting pneumonia. His trusted driver of 8 years, Michael Chen, handled the wheel. "I apologize, sir," Chen said, looking at Hayes through the rearview mirror. "I didn't realize I was going over the limit." Hayes nodded, too tired to respond. At 58, he had served as Attorney General for just over 2 years, working hard to reform the justice system. Tonight, however, he wasn't thinking about his role as the nation's top law enforcement official. His thoughts were with his mother, whose condition had worsened over the past week. Officer Morrison stepped out of his patrol car, his boots splashing in the puddles. Rain dripped from his cap as he approached the SUV. His body camera recorded everything, standard procedure for all D.C. police officers. The tinted windows of the Escalade made him uneasy. In his experience, vehicles like this often meant trouble. Morrison tapped on the driver's window with his flashlight, harder than necessary. Chen lowered the window, and warm air from inside the vehicle mixed with the cold rain. "License and registration," Morrison barked, shining his light directly into Chen's face. "Do you know how fast you were going?" "Officer, I apologize," Chen replied calmly, reaching slowly for his wallet. "I was taking Mr. Hayes to the hospital to visit his mother. I must have." "I didn't ask where you were going," Morrison cut him off. "I asked if you know how fast you were going." In the back seat, Hayes noticed Morrison's aggressive tone. As Attorney General, he had dealt with thousands of police officers, most of them professional and courteous. Something about Morrison's behavior seemed off, perhaps stress, maybe personal problems, or just a bad day. 48 in a 35, Morrison continued, his voice getting louder. "That's 13 over the limit. In the rain. At night." Chen handed over his license and registration with steady hands. "Again, I apologize, officer. It won't happen again." Morrison studied the documents under his flashlight. "Who's your passenger?" he demanded, directing his beam toward the back seat. Hayes leaned forward slightly. "Good evening, officer. I'm Robert Hayes, the attorney." "Step out of the vehicle," Morrison ordered, cutting him off. "Both of you." "Officer, I don't think that's necessary," Hayes began. "If you just let me." "I said step out." Morrison's hand moved to rest on his holstered weapon. "Now." The tension in the air thickened. Chen looked back at Hayes, unsure what to do. Hayes nodded slightly, knowing that arguing would only make things worse. They both knew that for people of color, even minor traffic stops could turn dangerous if an officer felt challenged. As rain continued to fall, both men slowly opened their doors. The street was mostly empty, with only occasional cars passing by, their headlights creating ghostly reflections in the wet pavement. A nearby streetlight cast everything in a harsh yellow glow. Officer Morrison didn't know it yet, but his next actions would soon make headlines across the nation. His body camera continued recording, capturing every word and movement of what would become one of the most notorious traffic stops in recent history. In just a few minutes, his 15-year career would be forever changed, and he would learn a harsh lesson about power, prejudice, and consequences. What happened next would spark a national conversation about police reform, but for now, it was just 3 men standing in the rain on a cold October night in Washington, D.C., their lives about to intersect in ways none of them could have predicted. The rain grew heavier as Attorney General Hayes and his driver Michael Chen stood on the wet sidewalk. Officer Morrison's flashlight beam bounced between them, casting harsh shadows on their faces. Cars drove past slowly, their headlights illuminating the scene in brief flashes. "Hands where I can see them," Morrison shouted, even though both men already had their hands raised. Water dripped from Hayes' expensive suit, and Chen's uniform was getting soaked. Morrison seemed to enjoy their discomfort, taking his time as he circled them like a predator. "Officer, if you just allow me to reach for my identification," Hayes said calmly, trying to defuse the situation. His years of experience handling tense legal negotiations had taught him the value of staying composed. "I can prove who I am." "Sure, you're the Attorney General," Morrison sneered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "And I'm the President of the United States. Keep your hands up." His right hand remained close to his weapon, a gesture that wasn't lost on either Hayes or Chen. Chen spoke up, his voice steady despite his growing concern. "Officer Morrison, I can show you Mr. Hayes' official credentials. They're in the glove compartment." "Did I say you could speak?" Morrison snapped, turning his flashlight directly into Chen's eyes. "You rich people with your fancy cars think you can make up any story. Think you're above the law, don't you?" A second police car pulled up behind Morrison's vehicle, its lights flashing but siren off. Officer Sarah Rodriguez stepped out, a 3-year veteran of the force. She had heard Morrison's call for backup, but couldn't understand why he needed it for a simple traffic stop. Hayes saw an opportunity for a more reasonable conversation. "Officer Rodriguez," he called out, recognizing her from a police community event he had attended months ago. But before she could respond, Morrison stepped between them. "I didn't say you could talk to her." Morrison's face was red with anger. "You think you can just take control of the situation? Is that how it works in your world?" Rodriguez approached cautiously, confused by Morrison's aggressive behavior. She had worked with him before and had never seen him this agitated. "Everything okay here, Jim?" she asked, trying to assess the situation. "Just dealing with some wise guys who think they're above the law," Morrison replied, not taking his eyes off Hayes and Chen. "This one claims he's the Attorney General." He laughed mockingly. Hayes slowly reached toward his jacket pocket. "Officer Rodriguez, if you could just—" "Gun!" Morrison suddenly shouted, drawing his weapon with frightening speed. "On the ground. Now!" Rodriguez instinctively drew her weapon too, but quickly realized Hayes was making no threatening moves. His hands were barely moving from their raised position. "Down! Face down!" Morrison screamed, his gun pointed directly at Hayes' chest. The Attorney General and Chen had no choice but to comply, lying face down in the growing puddles on the sidewalk. Passing cars began to slow down. Some drivers pulled out their phones, recording the scene. Within minutes, several videos would be uploaded to social media, showing the U.S. Attorney General lying in the rain with a police officer's gun pointed at him. "Officer Morrison," Rodriguez said firmly, finally recognizing Hayes. "I think there's been a mistake. That really is. Stay back," Morrison ordered, his judgment clouded by adrenaline and anger. "I've got this under control." Hayes remained still, his cheek pressed against the wet concrete. In his decades of legal work, he had heard countless stories of police encounters gone wrong. Now he was living one. The rain soaked through his clothes as Morrison continued to shout orders, each one more aggressive than the last. Chen, lying next to Hayes, whispered, "I'm sorry, sir. This is my fault for speeding." "Be quiet," Morrison yelled, taking a step closer, his gun still trained on them. More police cars were arriving now, their lights creating a disco-like effect in the rain. Among them was Captain Lisa Wheeler, Morrison's supervisor. As she stepped out of her car, she immediately recognized the scene for what it was, a massive mistake that would have serious consequences for everyone involved. The next few moments would determine not just Officer Morrison's future, but would spark a national debate about police power, prejudice, and the need for reform. For now, though, the Attorney General of the United States lay face down on a rainy Washington sidewalk, a victim of the very system he had spent his career trying to improve. Captain Lisa Wheeler stepped out of her patrol car, immediately taking control of the chaotic scene. Rain continued to fall as red and blue lights flashed across Constitution Avenue, now crowded with police vehicles. Several bystanders had gathered under storefront awnings, their phones recording everything. "Officer Morrison," Captain Wheeler's voice cut through the noise, "stand down immediately." Morrison kept his gun pointed at Hayes and Chen. "Captain, these suspects where?" "Those aren't suspects," Wheeler interrupted sharply. That's the Attorney General of the United States. Morrison's face went pale, but he didn't lower his weapon. They were speeding, and he reached for something. Wheeler approached carefully, her voice firm but controlled. "Lower your weapon, officer. That's an order." The growing crowd of onlookers murmured as more people recognized Hayes. Someone in the crowd shouted, "That's police brutality." Others joined in, their voices getting louder. Hayes remained face down on the wet sidewalk, his expensive suit now completely soaked. Despite his uncomfortable position, his mind was already working on how this incident could lead to meaningful change. Next to him, Chen stayed perfectly still, knowing any movement could make things worse. "I said lower your weapon, Morrison," Wheeler commanded again. This time, Morrison slowly lowered his gun, his hands shaking. The reality of what he had done was starting to sink in. "Attorney General Hayes," Wheeler called out, "you and Mr. Chen can get up now. I deeply apologize for this incident." As Hayes and Chen carefully stood up, more senior police officials arrived at the scene. News vans were beginning to appear too, their reporters already going live with the breaking story. U.S. Attorney General held at gunpoint during traffic stop. Morrison stood frozen, his face a mix of fear and shame. His body camera was still recording, capturing every moment of his massive mistake. Officer Rodriguez, who had witnessed everything, was already writing her report of the incident. "Would you like to press charges, sir?" Wheeler asked Hayes quietly. Hayes brushed water from his suit, his expression thoughtful. "Not at this moment, Captain, but I would like Officer Morrison's badge number and a copy of all body camera footage." Morrison finally found his voice. "Sir, I didn't know who you were." Hayes turned to face him, his voice steady and clear. "And that's precisely the problem, Officer Morrison. Would knowing my identity have changed how you treated us? Should it matter if I'm the Attorney General or just another citizen?" The crowd had grown larger, despite the rain. People were live streaming the confrontation, and social media was already exploding with videos of the incident. Hashtag Attorney General Hayes and hashtag police brutality were trending within minutes. "I was just following procedure," Morrison mumbled, but even he didn't seem to believe his own words. Forcing two unarmed men to lie face down in the rain at gunpoint for a minor traffic violation is procedure. Hayes asked, his legal training evident in his measured tone. Refusing to check identification is procedure. Making assumptions based on appearance is procedure. Chen, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. "Sir, your mother is still waiting at the hospital." Hayes checked his watch. It was past 10 p.m. now. His mother's condition was serious, and this incident had delayed his visit. The irony wasn't lost on him. Even as the nation's top law enforcement official, he wasn't immune to the problems he'd been fighting against. "Captain Wheeler," Hayes said, "I trust you'll handle this situation appropriately. I need to visit my mother, but my office will be in touch tomorrow morning." Wheeler nodded. "Of course, sir. We'll provide all necessary documentation and footage. Again, I sincerely apologize." As Hayes and Chen walked back to their SUV, Morrison called out, "Sir, please. My family depends on this job." Hayes paused but didn't turn around. "Officer Morrison, tomorrow morning, thousands of people will watch videos of you pointing a gun at two unarmed citizens because of a minor traffic violation. The consequences of your actions tonight will be determined by proper procedures, the very procedures you chose to ignore." The crowd parted as Hayes and Chen got back into their vehicle. As they drove away, the rain continued to fall on Officer Morrison, who stood watching his career wash away with each passing moment. His body camera recorded everything: his aggression, his prejudice, and now his fear. The next few days would change not just his life, but would spark a national conversation about police reform that couldn't be ignored. By sunrise the next morning, the video of Officer Morrison pointing his gun at Attorney General Hayes had gone viral. Every major news channel played the footage on repeat, showing Hayes and his driver lying face down in the rain while Morrison shouted threats at them. Social media exploded with millions of views and shares. Morrison sat alone in Captain Wheeler's office, staring at a TV mounted on the wall. CNN was showing his body camera footage. The timestamp read 9:58 p.m., and he watched himself yelling at the Attorney General of the United States. His hands shook as he held a cup of cold coffee. 4 million views already, Captain Wheeler said as she walked into her office. She dropped a thick folder on her desk. and that's just on Twitter. Every news station in the country is running this story. Morrison's face was pale. He hadn't slept all night. Captain, I can explain. Explain what, Morrison? Wheeler interrupted, her voice sharp. Explain why you pulled a gun on two unarmed men, why you refused to check their ID, or why you forced the Attorney General to lie in the rain. Outside the office, the police station was chaos. Reporters crowded the entrance, hoping to get a statement. Phone lines were ringing nonstop. Officers tried to work normally, but everyone kept glancing at Morrison through the office windows. My wife saw it on the morning news. Morrison said quietly, "My kids, they're asking why Daddy is on TV pointing a gun at people." Wheeler sat down at her desk and opened the folder. "Your record shows 6 complaints about aggressive behavior in the past year alone. We warned you about this, Morrison, multiple times." On the TV, a panel of experts discussed the incident. One of them, a former police chief, called it a perfect example of everything wrong with current police practices. Another expert pointed out how Morrison's behavior showed clear bias. Morrison's phone buzzed constantly with messages. Some were from fellow officers, but most were from strangers who had found his number. Many messages contained threats and angry words. "The Attorney General's office just sent this," Wheeler said, holding up a document. "They want all your body camera footage from the past 6 months. They're launching a full investigation." Morrison swallowed hard. "Will I lose my badge?" Before Wheeler could answer, Officer Rodriguez knocked and entered the office. "Captain, you need to see this." She held up her phone, showing a live press conference. Attorney General Hayes stood at a podium outside the Justice Department building. He looked tired but determined. "Last night's incident," Hayes was saying, "reflects a systemic problem in our law enforcement. This isn't about one officer or one traffic stop. This is about a culture that needs to change." Morrison watched, his heart sinking as Hayes continued. "Officer Morrison's actions will be thoroughly investigated," Hayes said. "But more importantly, we will use this incident to push for meaningful police reform. Next week, I will present a comprehensive plan to Congress." Wheeler muted the TV and turned to Morrison. "Internal Affairs will be here in an hour. They'll want your badge and gun until the investigation is complete." Morrison nodded slowly, finally understanding the full impact of his actions. "What do I tell my family?" "Tell them the truth," Wheeler replied. "Tell them you made assumptions based on prejudice. Tell them you let anger cloud your judgment. Tell them actions have consequences." Rodriguez, still standing by the door, spoke up. "The police union representative is here. He wants to talk to Officer Morrison." "Send him in," Wheeler said. "Morrison, you'll need all the help you can get. This isn't going away anytime soon." As if to emphasize her point, they heard chanting outside. A crowd had gathered in front of the police station, holding signs demanding justice and reform. News helicopters circled overhead, capturing aerial shots of the growing protest. Morrison stood up slowly, his legs weak. Through the window, he could see his fellow officers avoiding eye contact. Some who had praised his tough approach yesterday now pretended not to know him. "One more thing," Wheeler added as Morrison reached for the door. "Attorney General Hayes' mother passed away early this morning. Because of your actions, he missed his last chance to see her alive." This final revelation hit Morrison like a physical blow. He grabbed the door frame for support, the full weight of his actions finally crashing down on him. His career, his reputation, and his future now hung by a thread, all because of one traffic stop and a series of bad decisions that revealed the prejudice he hadn't even realized he carried. 1 week after the incident, Officer Morrison sat in his small apartment, surrounded by empty coffee cups and newspapers. The TV played in the background, muted, but still showing coverage of what people now called the Hayes incident. His wife had taken their kids to stay with her parents, unable to handle the constant media attention and angry phone calls. Across town, in his office at the Justice Department, Attorney General Hayes reviewed the final report of Morrison's past conduct. The thick file showed a pattern. Morrison had consistently been aggressive with minority drivers, though most incidents hadn't been reported officially. "Sir," his assistant Sarah entered with more documents. "The press is waiting for your decision. Will you press criminal charges against Officer Morrison?" Hayes looked at the framed photo on his desk, the last picture taken with his mother, just weeks before she passed away. The night of the incident should have been their final moments together. Instead, he'd spent it face down on wet pavement. Set up a meeting, Hayes said finally. I want to talk to Morrison personally. 2 days later, Morrison walked through the Justice Department's front doors. Protesters outside recognized him, their shouts following him into the building. He looked different now, unshaven, wearing a cheap suit instead of his police uniform. His badge and gun had been taken during the investigation. Mr. Morrison, Hayes' assistant greeted him coldly. The Attorney General will see you now. Morrison entered the large office, his legs shaking. Hayes sat behind his desk, looking through a window at the Washington Monument in the distance. The room felt too big, too quiet. Sit down, Mr. Morrison, Hayes said without turning around. The formal Mr. instead of officer wasn't lost on Morrison. Sir, Morrison started, but Hayes raised his hand. Before you speak, Hayes turned to face him. I want you to watch something. He pressed a button on his desk, and a large screen lowered from the ceiling. It showed police body camera footage, not from their incident, but from other traffic stops Morrison had conducted. One after another, the videos showed him being aggressive with minority drivers. 15 incidents in the past year, Hayes said quietly, all following the same pattern, all showing the same prejudice. Morrison stared at the screen, seeing himself through new eyes. Each video showed something he had justified at the time as proper procedure or being cautious. Your police union wants to protect you, Hayes continued. They're arguing that you followed procedure. Captain Wheeler wants to fire you. The public wants you arrested. He paused. What do you think should happen? Morrison looked down at his hands. I never thought of myself as prejudiced. I always said I treated everyone the same. The evidence suggests otherwise. Hayes picked up a remote and switched off the screen. But here's what interests me. Not one of these people filed an official complaint. They accepted this treatment as normal. That's what needs to change. Standing up, Hayes walked to a whiteboard covered in notes and diagrams. I'm launching a new police reform initiative. Body cameras aren't enough. We need better training, better screening, better accountability. Morrison watched as Hayes outlined his plan. The Attorney General's mother's funeral had been just 3 days ago, yet here he was, working to create change instead of seeking revenge. Sir, Morrison found his voice. Why am I here? Hayes turned from the whiteboard. Because you have a choice to make. You can fight the charges, claim you did nothing wrong, and probably lose everything. Or, he paused, you can help me fix the system that made your actions seem acceptable. How? By telling your story. By admitting your mistakes and helping other officers recognize their own biases. By being an example of how people can change. Morrison thought about his kids asking why he wasn't a police officer anymore. He thought about all the people he treated unfairly, thinking he was just doing his job. It won't be easy, Hayes warned. Many of your former colleagues will see you as a traitor. The public won't forgive quickly, but real change never is easy. Outside the office windows, protest chants could still be heard. News vans lined the street, waiting for an announcement about Morrison's fate. Inside, 2 men, one who had misused power and one who had suffered from that misuse, began planning how to turn a moment of injustice into a movement for change. Morrison looked at Hayes and made his decision. Where do we start? 3 months after the infamous traffic stop, Morrison stood nervously backstage at the National Police Reform Conference in Chicago. Through the curtain, he could see hundreds of police officers, chiefs, and city officials filling the large hall. Attorney General Hayes stood at the podium, preparing to introduce him. Many of you know James Morrison from the viral video, Hayes began, his voice carrying through the speakers. But today, you'll meet a different man. Morrison touched his tie, making sure it was straight. He'd practiced his speech hundreds of times, but speaking to fellow officers about his mistakes was harder than facing any criminal. His hands trembled as he held his notes. Ladies and gentlemen, Hayes continued, the face of police reform isn't always who you expect. Sometimes, it's someone who made mistakes and chose to learn from them. Please welcome former Officer James Morrison. The audience's applause was polite but cold. As Morrison walked to the podium, he saw many familiar faces in the crowd, officers he'd worked with, trainers from the academy, even Captain Wheeler sitting in the front row. Some would meet his eyes, others stared with open hostility. 3 months ago, Morrison began, his voice shaking slightly. I pointed my gun at the Attorney General of the United States during a routine traffic stop. I forced him to lie face down in the rain. I didn't listen when he tried to identify himself. I acted out of prejudice and anger. The room was completely silent. In the back, news cameras recorded everything. But that's not why I'm here today, Morrison continued, growing more confident. I'm here because that incident wasn't a one-time mistake. It was the result of years of learned behavior, hidden biases, and a system that didn't stop me. He clicked a button, and the screen behind him showed clips from his body camera footage. Various traffic stops where he'd been aggressive with minority drivers. I told myself I was following procedure, he explained. I said I was being cautious, but watching these videos now, I see something different. I see fear, not from the drivers, from me. Fear I didn't even know I had. In the audience, some officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others nodded slowly, perhaps recognizing similar moments from their own experiences. Attorney General Hayes could have pressed charges, Morrison said. Instead, he asked me to help change the system. Today, we're launching the National Police Accountability and Reform Training Program, NPRT. Hayes joined him at the podium as they unveiled the program's details. It included new training methods, psychological screening tools, and community engagement requirements. Morrison would travel to police departments across the country, sharing his story and helping officers recognize their own biases. This isn't about pointing fingers, Morrison explained. It's about honest self-reflection. Every officer in this room joined the force to protect and serve. But somewhere along the way, some of us forgot who we're protecting and serving. Captain Wheeler stood up, surprising everyone. I have a question, she said. How do you answer officers who say this program will make them hesitate in dangerous situations? Morrison looked at Hayes, who nodded encouragingly. Being professional isn't the same as being weak, Morrison replied. This program teaches officers to respond to actual threats, not imagined ones based on prejudice. I didn't face any real danger that night with the Attorney General. I created danger because of my assumptions. As the presentation continued, more officers began asking questions. Some shared their own experiences. Others expressed concerns about the changes. But the hostile stares had been replaced by thoughtful expressions. Change isn't easy, Hayes told the audience near the end. But it's necessary. Officer Morrison could have lost everything because of his actions that night. Instead, he chose to become part of the solution. After the presentation, several officers approached Morrison. One young officer admitted he'd seen himself in some of Morrison's body camera footage. Another shared a story about almost making the similar mistake. You're very brave, Captain Wheeler told Morrison later. Not many officers would admit their mistakes so publicly. Morrison watched as Hayes talked with police chiefs about implementing the program. 3 months ago, he'd been a symbol of everything wrong with policing. Now, he was helping to fix those problems. It's not bravery, he told Wheeler. It's responsibility. We owe it to ourselves and our communities to do better. Outside the conference hall, protesters still carried signs demanding police reform. But today, for the first time, Morrison didn't see them as enemies. They were reminders of why his work mattered. Why facing his mistakes and changing the system was so important. 6 months into the NPRT program, Morrison stood in front of a mirror in a small hotel room in Detroit, adjusting his tie. On the TV, a local news station was showing his old body camera footage again, promoting his speech at the police academy later that morning. His phone buzzed, a text from his wife. Good luck today. Kids made you a good luck card. We'll show you on video chat tonight. Things were slowly improving with his family. They were still living apart, but the weekly visits with his children had become less tense. At the Detroit Police Academy, young cadets filled the auditorium. These future officers would be among the first to go through the new training program he and Attorney General Hayes had developed. Morrison noticed some cadets whispering and pointing as he walked in. They recognized him from the viral video. You all know who I am, Morrison began, skipping the usual introduction. You've seen the video. You've probably talked about it in your classes. 312 million views on YouTube. I'm the cop who pointed a gun at the Attorney General. He clicked through slides showing newspaper headlines about the incident. The cadets sat silently, watching. But today, I want to show you something else, Morrison continued. He played a new video, body camera footage from the day before his infamous traffic stop. It showed him being aggressive with a young black driver, making assumptions, escalating a simple situation. This wasn't unusual for me, Morrison explained. This was my normal. I didn't see anything wrong with it at the time, just like some of you might not see anything wrong with it now. In the back of the room, he noticed Attorney General Hayes quietly entering. They hadn't planned to meet until next week in Washington, but Hayes often surprised him by showing up at these training sessions. Yesterday, Morrison continued, that driver from the video visited me. His name is Marcus Thompson. He's a high school teacher, has 2 kids, coaches baseball. He showed me how the traffic stop affected him, how his hands shake now whenever he sees police lights in his mirror. The cadets shifted uncomfortably. Morrison could see some of them taking notes. The old training would tell you that officer safety comes first, that it's better to be aggressive than sorry, that assuming the worst keeps you alive. Morrison paused. That training is wrong. That training creates fear, in us and in the communities we serve. He walked through the new training protocols, how to approach vehicles without prejudice, how to communicate respectfully, how to recognize when their own fears were creating danger rather than responding to it. During the question and answer session, a cadet raised her hand. But what if someone really is dangerous? What if being careful gets us killed? Hayes stepped forward from the back. May I answer that? He asked Morrison. The cadets straightened in their seats as Hayes walked to the front. Officer safety is crucial, he said. But true safety comes from good judgment, not fear. Mr. Morrison and I analyzed thousands of traffic stops. Want to know what we found? The more aggressive the officer, the more likely the situation was to become dangerous. Morrison nodded. The night I pulled over the Attorney General, I created danger where none existed. My actions, my fears, my prejudices, they made a simple traffic stop into a national crisis. After the session, several cadets stayed to talk. One young man admitted he joined the academy because a police officer had helped his family during a crisis. I want to be that kind of cop, he said. Not the kind in your video. Later that evening, Morrison sat in his hotel room, video chatting with his kids. They proudly showed him their hand-drawn card. Good job teaching police officers, Daddy. His phone buzzed with a text from Hayes. Great session today. The cadets really listened. Change is happening. Morrison looked at his reflection in the hotel window. The man who had pointed a gun at the Attorney General was gone, replaced by someone working to prevent others from making the same mistakes. It wasn't full redemption. That would take years of work, but it was a start. He clicked through his presentation for tomorrow's session at another police department. Each slide reminded him of how far he'd come and how far law enforcement still needed to go. But for the first time in his career, he felt like he was truly serving and protecting by helping change a system that needed changing. His daughter's voice brought him back to the video chat. Daddy, are you helping police officers be nice now? Morrison smiled. Yes, sweetheart. I'm helping them be the kind of police officers everyone deserves. 1 year after the traffic stop incident, the Justice Department's main conference room was packed with reporters, police chiefs, and community leaders. Large screens showed statistics about the NPRT program's first year, over 200 police departments participating, more than 15,000 officers trained, and a 40% reduction in complaint rates at participating stations. Morrison sat in the front row, his family beside him for the first time at a public event. His daughter held his hand while his son proudly wore a small NPRT Junior Ambassador badge. His wife, who had moved back home 3 months ago, squeezed his shoulder supportively. Attorney General Hayes stood at the podium, preparing to deliver his assessment of the program's first year. Behind him, a slide showed the famous photo of him lying on the wet pavement that night, now used as a symbol of how a crisis led to change. 1 year ago, Hayes began, a routine traffic stop exposed problems that had existed in our police departments for generations. Today, we're here to show you how one incident of injustice helped create a movement for justice. He clicked to the next slide, showing Morrison teaching at various police academies across the country. Mr. Morrison could have become just another example of what's wrong with policing. Instead, he chose to become part of the solution. Morrison watched as Hayes presented the program's results. Body camera footage now showed officers handling difficult situations with calm professionalism. Community trust scores had improved. Even traffic stop statistics showed significant changes in racial disparities. "Daddy," his daughter whispered, "that's you on the big screen." The new video showed Morrison's most recent training session, where he worked with officers on recognizing and overcoming their biases. His son sat up straighter, proud to see his father teaching others. But numbers don't tell the whole story, Hayes continued. Real change happens one person at a time. He gestured to the back of the room, where Marcus Thompson, the teacher Morrison had once treated roughly during a traffic stop, stood up. "Mr. Thompson isn't just a survivor of biased policing," Hayes explained. "He's now part of our Civilian Oversight Committee, helping ensure our reforms create lasting change." Thompson walked to the podium. "A year ago, I was afraid every time I saw police lights," he said. "Today, I work with officers to build trust between police and communities. That wouldn't have happened without Mr. Morrison's honesty about his mistakes." Morrison felt tears in his eyes as Thompson talked about their work together. His wife held his hand tighter, knowing how much this moment meant. Hayes returned to the podium. "Today, we're announcing the expansion of NPART to include all federal law enforcement agencies. But more importantly, we're introducing new legislation to make these reforms mandatory nationwide." The room erupted in applause. Morrison's children clapped loudly, making him smile despite the tears. "Mr. Morrison," Hayes called out, "would you join me up here?" As Morrison walked to the podium, he remembered that rainy night 1 year ago. How different things could have been if Hayes had chosen punishment over reform, anger over change. "This program started because two men chose to learn from a mistake rather than repeat it," Hayes told the audience. James Morrison could have lost everything. Instead, he helped change everything. Morrison stepped to the microphone, looking out at the crowd. He saw Captain Wheeler, who now helped run NPRT training. Officer Rodriguez, who had witnessed the incident, was there with her new community outreach team. Even some of the protesters who had demanded his firing now worked with the program. "A year ago, I was the problem," Morrison said simply. "Today, I'm part of the solution. But the real heroes are the officers who admit they need to change, the communities who give us a chance to earn back their trust, and leaders like Attorney General Hayes who choose progress over punishment." His children beamed at him from the front row. They no longer had to explain why their dad was that cop from the video. Now they proudly told people he was helping make police better. After the presentation, as people mingled and discussed the program's future, Hayes approached Morrison's family. "Your father is doing important work," he told Morrison's children. "He's helping make sure what happened that night doesn't happen to anyone else." Morrison looked around the room, at his supportive family, at the positive changes in policing, at the partnerships being built between officers and communities. One terrible night had led to all this. Sometimes, he realized, the worst moments can lead to the best changes. His daughter tugged at his sleeve. "Daddy, are you a good cop now?" Morrison knelt down beside her. "No, sweetheart. I'm something better. I'm helping all cops be good cops."